All right, my friends, let's jump in. Last time we had a chance to speak, we talked in our sole lecture about Notes from Underground and the works of Fyodor Dostoevsky. If you are very much impressed by the work of Dostoevsky, I would highly recommend that you read his greatest work at some point, and also one of his final works, which is called Brothers Karamazov, The Brothers Karamazov. I also recommend, this is perhaps a little bit more in line with the age at which you happen to be at this time. You might be very interested also in his second greatest work, Crime and Punishment, sometimes a little bit more famous to the popular audience, though not more famous, more famous to the total observing population that reads Dostoevsky. It is itself about a young man who is a poor former student, law student, as it were, just a couple years older than you, and perhaps has a lot of ideas floating around his head that you are yourself kicking about at this point. And yet he makes what I might describe as a big mistake based on philosophical notions lurking in his mind. And is himself a resentful and sort of ugly character, in the same way that the underground man is very much not a beautiful soul, but might be one of the more wretched souls that you have ever read. So we move from the 19th century now to the 20th century. The work that we are reading is set prior to World War I, as the next work we will read is also set prior to World War I. This one is set in 1904, though it was published in 1922. So something to note immediately about this Ulysses is that World War I, the Great War as it was then known, had already happened and infused the writing of this work, though the narrative of the work itself occurs prior to World War I. So you might consider this work pregnant with the meaning of the Great War and what is to come just after it, just 10 years after the events of what is called Bloomsday. We'll also talk a little bit about how Ulysses, its structure, its format, very modernist, and that it takes place over the course of a single day and is itself modeled on a mythic blueprint, that of the Odyssey by Homer, of course, with the Latin name, which has some resonance, has some meaning. The second work that we will talk about that also encounters, that also is set prior to World War I, but is written afterwards and published afterwards, in fact, published 4 years after, 2 years after, James Joyce's Ulysses is the Magic Mountain. So we will read two works that contain World War I in the history of their authors, and yet not in the history of their pages. In fact, the Magic Mountain takes place over 7 years, not just one day like Ulysses. Very interesting comparison of uses of time there, if you're interested in that. And it goes from 1907 to the very beginning of World War I, the Great War in Germany, 1914. In fact, the protagonist, Hans Castor, very mediocre, poor, ordinary man, depending on the valence of the word you wish to describe him, the connotations of it. He ends up on a battlefield, and perhaps does not do so well on the battlefield, given how World War I was fought. You may have heard that it was when trench warfare and the use of mortars were made very popular. Also, the use of various gases, poisonous gases that would be used to root out troops in these tunnels. This is where the term shell shock came from. It has become a colloquial term for the condition that people now call post-traumatic stress disorder. Keep in mind how wide this term has gone, trauma. Now people can be traumatized by definition by, say, a word or a stare even by somebody. But the original concept was made to be affixed to soldiers who were at war and had giant bombs being dropped right near them and often on top of them, which would shoot limbs of their friends all around them, as well as shrapnel, and could end their history walking, reproducing, or even living. And so the manner of combat that was present in the Great War was the most violent sort of combat that had ever existed. And perhaps, given how warfare is now conducted, ever will exist as well. You may know that it is more frequent, say, to send drones onto the battlefield now than, say, American troops. And we'll see how war continues to develop. If you're very interested in that, that's something you certainly can study. But that is to say that there was a great fissure that occurred in this world between the wars that were conducted, say, in the 19th century, wars of imperialism, wars of civil wars like the American Civil War, and the sort of new industrial age, factory backed mechanical engineering feats that would lead to the sort of battle that made World War I and World War II extraordinarily bloody. And so this is the world in which the authors that we are reading now lived. And this is something that they experienced in their own lives. So when you talk to people from 2 generations before you, often they remember things like the assassination of John F. Kennedy. When you talk to people of my generation, they often remember seeing the 2 towers destroyed. In fact, I was in a classroom and saw it happen on the television. But if you were to talk to people from 3, 4 generations before, they would have been through the Great War, which was the most significant event of the vast majority of people on the planet's life, particularly in Western Europe as well as the United States. And so I want to properly frame the literature that we are reading for the remainder of the semester, our second half of the literature. But let's get to our author himself, James Joyce. James Joyce was born February 2nd, 1882. He entered Clonmel Wood College, a prestigious Jesuit boarding school, several years after. Something you should know about him is he had a Jesuit education. The Jesuits are the learned SJ sort of scholars of the Catholic faith, in fact, very famous for going to China and translating the Bible into Chinese. They really became sort of the figureheads of arguments they were apologists, arguments in favor of the Catholic faith after the Dominicans started to lose hold after the Middle Ages. There's still Jesuit schools. Perhaps some of you went to a school called Jesuit, and in fact, even in this state, there is a very famous Jesuit university called Loyola University. And I myself went to a Jesuit school called Marquette at the top of the Mississippi River, as it were. So his education and his life was rooted in Roman Catholicism, though you will soon see that both James Joyce and his one of the 3 main characters or protagonists in this work, Stephen Dedalus, is Jesuit educated, yet he is not himself particularly faithful. He has questions. He has objections to that which he has learned. He's truly brilliant, which means that which is told to him does not just imprint on his mind and become what he thinks. It becomes the material with which he thinks. You should make this distinction when people try to propagandize you against learning. Everything you learn, it doesn't control you. It becomes that which you are capable of controlling in order to see that which is. This is why a little learning is bad for somebody. You learn a little, what do you have to measure your little learning against? Well, you learn a lot. You can start to see how things actually work together, and perhaps make them work for you. This is my own exhortation to you, not just to learn what's put in front of you. Learn everything you possibly can, given your times and the time you have and inclination. So in any case, 1898, he enters University College Dublin, learns French, Italian, German, and Latin. You can see all of these languages represented in the pages of Ulysses, perhaps to your consternation and frustration. He graduated in 1902 and initially intended to pursue medicine. I've told you a little bit about education prior to the 20th century. There were only a few tracks: law, theology, and medicine. So many of our famous thinkers, including, say, William James, who was a famous philosopher and psychologist in the pragmatist tradition from America. He was a terrible student in undergrad, and in fact, was told that he would be given a degree in medicine only if he never practiced. But many of these thinkers that would become authors or philosophers, because of the nature of college education in the late 19th century, also intended or did study medicine. Some say it's not exactly the same as now, where if somebody got, say, a PhD in English and then also got an MD, it would be wildly impressive because of the amount of time that it would take for somebody to do that. Though, of course, there would be many. One would question how deep such a person's scholarship was. There are shortcuts that sometimes need to be taken in order to do things that sound impressive. Things that sound impressive. Well, all that glitters is not gold. In any case, 1903, he returns home to Ireland from France after learning by telegram, note the technological difference here, that his mother had cancer. One thing I'll say about James Joyce is that his mother had cancer. She went into a coma, and his uncle told him to go pray at her side, which seems like a fairly fair request. But you should know that James Joyce was a person of such intellectual integrity that he couldn't bring himself to pray by his mother because he was no longer a believer. So even though his mother was a believer, who raised him to be a Catholic, and he loved his mother, he was the most gifted child in his family, and with the best education, and also the most promise. This is something that was recognized in Ireland in the early 20th century, particularly because they were not quite as affluent, anywhere close to as affluent as, say, the United States is now. It was, in fact, a territory of the Brits. And we'll talk a little bit about these imperial and colonial elements. They perforate this text across multiple dimensions. But Joyce refused to pray. And this haunts him. How do we know that this haunts him? This haunts also his major character, Telemachus, Stephen Dedalus, who is modeled off of the Odyssey's Telemachus, the son of Odysseus. Joyce takes the story of his own mother's death and makes it a little bit more poignant and a little bit more tragic in fiction. Stephen Dedalus, when he returns home from France, like Joyce had, to his dying mother, she is not in a coma. She is alive. She personally requests that he pray over her, and he refuses. Can you imagine the feeling of denying the final request to somebody like your mother? Dying, loves you. Imagine that you have a pretty good relationship with her. She has loved you, treated you specially your entire life. The last thing she asks you is to show that you're a good boy or a good girl or a good whatever. And I feel like I might just say the words to make somebody dying happy. But Stephen Dedalus does not. And then she does die. And it haunts him. And it not only haunts him on the inside, because many things throughout his day in Ulysses, and you'll see this, remind him of his mother and what he did. A dead dog, a funeral. It's amazing the way that a human mind thinks in terms of association. Ralph Waldo Emerson says, no matter where you travel, your giant goes with you. The idea being, you can't get away from yourself. And the things that are going on in your head, you see them everywhere that you look. So you really cannot escape. And this is something that haunts Stephen Dedalus. Death in those who are dead. This is something that haunts our second main character, Leopold Bloom, who's himself about double the age of Stephen. Stephen is 21. He's your age. But he's finished his school and is now teaching. Leopold Bloom, just to mention, what haunts him is his mother is dead. But it was his father who committed suicide after his mother died that he thinks about. He thinks about how his father left him a note. He still has the note in a drawer. We will see it. That's part of the realism and the modernism of the text. There are lots of real things to touch and see in this representation of Dublin and those who live within it. But Virag, the name of Leopold's father, is Hungarian, asks Leopold Bloom to take care of his dog, Athos. Very human, touching moment. Says that he just can't live anymore without his wife. One note I'll make to you, and I've said this to you before, is that we know we've studied this macabre fact, that after a person's spouse dies, they are 50% more likely to die within the next 6 months. Not necessarily by their own hand, but by the sort of subtle mechanisms that govern the life force of an individual. Sometimes people just give up the will to live. If you go into a nursing program, for example, you will hear those words uttered to you over and over again. You can't make somebody heal who doesn't want to heal. You can't make someone live who wants to live. Correlated teaching is you can't make somebody learn who wants to learn. Doesn't matter how much you radiate warmth like the sun or illuminate like it. People don't need to be warm, nor do they need to be enlightened, as every generation proves over and over again. But these are men who are haunted. We also have our first female main character as well. Do you know why I hesitate to call them protagonists? There's a technical meaning, there's a technical reason. Any of you think you know? You don't need to necessarily have it 100%. Do you know what the difference between a protagonist and, say, a main character is? Yes? That's the idea. So, okay, so I'll tell you that that's sort of the distinction between a hero and a main character. But I have an annoying scholarly reason for saying protagonist is not quite right. Protagonist. I know all of you know I work with Greek and Latin. I probably think I know the suffixes and prefixes to every word. Not every word. See this pro? This messes up a lot of people. You know pro and con? I'm for or against something. Pro is the full preposition from Latin. Con is short for contra. This is not pro from Latin. A lot of people think for, like it's like they're fighting for the text. Agon and agony means a contest. So like for the contest. The word is actually from Greek, is protos. But the word proton that you've learned in your chemistry and physics classes. Protos, like prototype. You know what protos means? It means the same as primus in Latin. It means first. So the protagonist is technically which character in a narrative? The first one which you meet. And so in a story with three main characters, who is the protagonist? Who is primary? Well, that's one of the questions of it. So if I call any of these three main characters protagonists, it is using language a little bit sloppily, or at least generally, just to convey a point. But you should know this. Also, we have fancy words that are rarely used, like deuteragonist for the second person. Deuteros means two, just like protos means, or rather means second, just like protos means first. The difference between ordinal numbers, ranking numbers, like first, second, third, fourth, and other numbers. I'm forgetting the name for them, which are like 1, 2, 3, 4. In any case, ordo means rank. Back to the timeline. 1904, the year that Ulysses is set in fact, June 16th, which is called Bloomsday. This is a very literary thing to celebrate. 16 June, now that you will have read Ulysses or some bit of it, you are very much welcome into this club of literary individuals who like to often throw little parties on such a day, sometimes drink Irish whiskey, which there very much is plenty of drinking in Ulysses, and sometimes do some sort of reading from James Joyce with fellow literateurs. It's a sort of sophisticated thing to enjoy, which not everybody knows the date of. So perhaps you will become a herald of James Joyce and tell everybody about Bloomsday, have them celebrate. I think you're at the time of life where you can really throw great parties, and especially interesting theme parties. So you should do it and maybe make a wonderful habit for the remainder of your lives. And this is the sort of party, if you tell people about it, if they have any knowledge of literature, they'll be very impressed. And they'll be, oh my gosh, I didn't even know you knew that day. And wow, it seems to mean something to you. Are you sure James Joyce, the greatest, or at least one of the greatest writers to ever existed? You like that? It's pretty good stuff. It's like saying that you like opera at your age. It's almost unbelievable. All right. In any case, 1904, James Joyce, for the first time, goes out with Nora Barnacle, whom he would elope with. Note the difference between eloping and marrying. Eloping is running away with somebody, not necessarily marrying. huge scandal in the early 20th century, and we'll talk about some scandals that underlie this text. In particular, a major political figure from Ireland, Irish Home Rule, named, oh no, his not, I was going to say John Henry Menton, but that's of course Charles Stewart Parnell. There we are. Names popping out of my head. I'm about to say Lee Harvey Oswald, just thinking of three named individuals, which that's an assassin of JFK, not a parliamentary figure from 19th century Irish political, or from the 19th century Irish political movement for home rule. But in any case, relationships between men and women and the valence of stepping outside of the marital bond will be a huge part of both the narrative. We'll talk a lot about Leopold Bloom and his own wife, the third main character of this text, Molly Bloom, who herself gets to speak, and a monologue that goes throughout the entire final chapter of this text. You might see that itself as an allegory for women's voices that denied for the first 17 of the 18 chapters, but then overtakes all in the 18th, particularly at the time when James Joyce is writing, just before Virginia Woolf will come to prominence, writing her own Mrs. Dalloway on the heels of James Joyce's work, just to add a little bit of political tension between these two. Note that Great Britain owned Ireland at this time. There had been great tension between them for about 700 years, since the 14th century. And so an Irish writer writing about Ireland, then having his work sort of reappropriated by an English writer. Virginia Woolf is an English writer who lived in London, the great city in the early 20th century. London in the early 20th century was in combat with New York for being the greatest city in the world in terms of finance and cultural cosmopolitanism, in the same way that Britain and the United States were both becoming super powerful. Britain was still more powerful than the United States until the end of World War I. In fact, the United States ends up taking over many geopolitical plans from Britain at that time, including helping to create the state of Israel, which was originally a British idea, which we will run into in this text itself. Talks about creating a Jewish state, which has been so, of course, in the news over the last couple of years for various reasons, including involving belligerence, war, fighting. But in any case, moving on. 1905, Dubliners was begun. It's a work of short stories by James Joyce, including The Dead, which is the final one, and is a Christmas story. Highly recommend you read that every Christmas. It's a wonderful work. Really has the feeling of being around young people in Christmas. 1916, in New York, a portrait of the artist as a young man. Very important to get the articles right in this work. It really does change the meaning to call it the portrait of an artist, as opposed to a portrait of the artist. Definite article as a young man. Note that it was published first in New York and then in England. This is a bit of a drama that you will see played out during James Joyce's life, that certain of his works were considered so obscene, in particular the one that you're reading right now, Ulysses, that it took a Supreme Court decision in the United States in order to take it off the banned books list. So if you're the sort of person that likes to get in the nooks and crannies that you're not supposed to, and if you hear that a book is banned and you have to read it, this is the book for you, though I will say this is a much more difficult book to read than the sorts that get banned these days. This was a book that was truly banned, not just from your local libraries and you could buy it on Amazon. It was not allowed to be published in the United States. And so you had to get an edition from a different country if you wanted it. So because of the content within this text, it was very difficult to get it published. But eventually it would be by through the help of a very, very colorful and strange American named Ezra Pound, who was a fantastic poet himself and wrote a very difficult, powerful work called the Cantos. but unfortunately devolved into fascism and came to really, really become a great fan of Italy during World War II and the doings of Il Duce Mussolini, the fascist dictator of Italy at that time. And in fact, Ezra Pound was eventually brought back to the United States, put into an sanatorium for the remainder of his days because of his political views. That is the man who was partially and perhaps prominently responsible for having Ulysses first published. And so when I say this is a colorful text with a colorful history, with colorful characters within it and without it as part of it, I am not exaggerating. I'm generalizing without giving really all the particulars that I need to, but such is the nature of giving a literary lecture. In any case, 1918, the first 3 chapters of Ulysses were sent to the little review. Note that it was written in parts, very like Notes from Underground was written in part, very much like Faust was written in parts. You're starting to notice that literary genesis happens in starts and stops, seemingly. It doesn't all happen at once. You may have thought of, how do you write a fictional novel? I know you just like sit down and write it in one day. Jack Kerouac is very famous for having written on the road on a roll of toilet paper over the course of one night after taking a bunch of snacks, some sort of methamphetamine. But then you have characters like Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. It took 50 years to write Faust. This work also took several years of composition, and then, of course, many years to be published in its own right because of writing. In any case, 3 chapters of Ulysses were sent to the Little Review, which was itself an avant-garde periodical with the help of Ezra Pound. 1922, Ulysses is finally published on Joyce's birthday. If you ever want to celebrate this, it's February 2nd. It was received as a scandalous work. Why? We'll talk about all of this in more or less detail, given how depend on how salacious the details are, and there are some salacious details. But this work, it features sex. And this is early 20th century. This is just on the heels of the Victorian era. It's a very sort of puritanical time. Very much, we might say in a more colloquial way, prudish time. People are tightly laced and stuffy, as it were. So coitus in here is well, it would scandalize people. Onanism. You may not know what the term onanism means. It means coitus interruptus. Do you know what those terms mean? These are sophisticated ways of describing the act of autoerotic, of acting autoerotic on oneself, of masturbation. This is featured by one of the main characters in the text. And it's done very subtly, but it is in the text. And so scandalous. Defecation. We see Bloom, just like he's also the one that commits the onanism. Onanism comes from a figure from the Old Testament named Onan, who spills his seed not within a woman, and so is misusing, according to the Old Testament, his seminal fluid. Something that Paul in the New Testament will talk about better in the belly of a prostitute than on the floor or whatever. In any case, that's where the name comes from. Coitus interruptus, coitus, you know, is the Latin word for sex. Interruptus, to interrupt, so having been interrupted, the process of reproducing. So those are just sophisticated ways of not having to say, well, usually people don't say the words for sex in sophisticated ways, they go the opposite, right? You saw this in White Lotus. Other single syllable words are often used from the lower classes. Infidelity takes place. In fact, one of the main characters cheats on another one of the main characters and intentionally leaves evidence of it in their shared bed. You might say, what's intentional evidence? Could it even, what about something left over from the man she cheated on with that only could have come from him, present on the sheets that her husband will later come into? Yes, that is there. But not just that, also crumbs from food. I, as somebody who sleeps in a bed and has a wife, that would almost, it's hard to say, the first thing would be terrible. But to find crumbs of food in one's bed too, Just the idea that somebody is being so entertained in one's own space by somebody that one loves is it creates a very, very ugly feeling within you. It's sort of feeling you can only really have, I think, when you own something and you think you know it, as it were. Not my wife, of course, but the bed. Very Odysseus-like. If you haven't read the Odyssey, when Penelope and Odysseus are finally reunited after 20 years, there's a huge scene involving their bed, where she tricks Odysseus and says, "Oh, well, I'll move. I'm not ready to sleep with you again. It's been 20 years. You're strange. You're a stranger to me now. Why don't I move our bed out, or have the servants move our bed out into the foyer for you, so you can sleep there, I'll sleep here." And he becomes enraged because he had built his house around a tree that is a poster of his bed, meaning his bed is what? Immovable. If his wife could move their bed, have it moved 20 at this point, that means she must have changed their bed, which to him symbolically would mean she obviously cheated on her. Changing the bed is like changing the sheets of the bed, which Molly Bloom refuses to do in any case. So beds are the site of, well, can be the site of great ethical, moral choices, relationship defining, perhaps epoch defining choices. When we talk more about Charles Stewart Parnell, we will make connections between him and Rudolph Bloom and Molly Bloom, but also between him and the start of the Trojan War between Helen, Menelaus, and Paris. There's a love triangle that has happened in Irish history that is just that is underlying what happens within the text of Ulysses. There's a political figure, great power and prominence named Charles Stewart Parnell, who himself was in a marriage, or excuse me, who found himself very much attracted to a woman named Catherine O'Shea, who was called Kitty O'Shea by the papers. You can see why they changed her name, right? Because you see the difference in connotation between calling someone Catherine and Kitty. You should know that Kitty meant prostitute at the time, so they wanted to portray her in a certain light and call her in a certain way. And she was herself in a loveless marriage with a captain, with the captain of the royal forces, and she and Charles Stewart Parnell had a long, enduring relationship in which they had 3 children. One of them died, but she was publicly divorced by her husband at one point, and in 1890 or so, 1889 or 1890, and then Charles Stewart Parnell married her, was not allowed to marry within the church. This was such a huge scandal, and was in fact then roundly condemned by the Irish priests and the Roman Catholic Church in Ireland. Lost his political influence, lost the ability to fight for Irish home rule. Ulysses begins when these hopes have been dashed. That Ireland thought that they had a chance to be free, to be their own sovereign nation. And then the man who was fighting to make that happen is ruined by a woman, by a relationship with her. This smacks of the Trojan War, where a woman is the cause of the Trojan War by being romantically abducted by Paris. You can see that there's sort of a history of this sort of thing too. If you look at Adam and Eve, sort of a history of blaming women with mythological force. This text called The Book of the City of Ladies by Christine de Pizan, who really talks about this, very, very interested in that concept, saying that these male authors have really not given a nice shape to women, and they've laid the worst things that have ever happened at their feet. Eve getting knocked out of paradise, Pandora from the Greek tradition, all evils come from a box that she brings with her. Helen of Troy, starting the largest war ever to exist, and then of course Charles Stewart Parnell and Catherine O'Shea. Ireland losing their capacity to be free because of an illegitimate relationship that Charles Stewart Parnell had with this woman. Very interesting. If you think about politics these days, particularly in America, can you imagine? Would one of our major political figures having a scandalous relationship ruin their political career? It sort of depends on who it is. You might think back to Bill Clinton, for example. He very famously had a scandalous affair with Monica Lewinsky. And well, whether that ruined his career or not is an interesting question. He was not removed from office. He was impeached. So you might think to yourself, have we changed a lot in the last 120 years or so in the so-called West? Or are we still basically the same? That's something I'm very interested in thinking about with you all. Also, of course, drunkenness is shown. We'll see a cookie box thrown at Bloom once he really goes off on a character who is modeled after a Cyclops called the Citizen. Another one of these characters who's not even given a name. He's called the Citizen. It's very much propagandist for all that is Irish, as it were. By age 50, this is about between 1932 and 1933, James Joyce had lost all of the sight in his left eye. In fact, often when you see him represented, he's got a patch over his left eye from this time and age. It's not because he's trying to be a pirate, but because he had lost vision in that eye. Unfortunately, think, well, what about the other eye? He's down to 10% of sight remaining in that eye. Now, so looking back historically, when a great writer goes blind, this puts him in a tradition with other great blind writers. Homer was supposedly blind, singer of the Iliad and the Odyssey. John Milton, of Paradise Lost fame, non-Servion. So that technically comes from Portrait of the Artist and the Young Man. He went blind, thought it was because of something he ate, and digestive gases coming up through his digestive system into his eyes. Biology and anatomy weren't as sophisticated we have these days. He was himself an English writer too. Joyce was not happy to be going blind. It caused him a ton of, you can read his letters, a ton of grief. And so as he gets older, his life, in his own opinion, starts to get worse. The darkness literally starts to close in on him. 1933, this is the Supreme Court case I mentioned earlier. The United States, versus one book named Ulysses, lifts the ban on the word in America. Note that this is 11 years after it is first published, so it takes quite a bit of time for this to happen. 1938, 1939, James Joyce's final work, which is itself something like a sequel to Ulysses and is dang near impossible to read coherently without something like Joseph Campbell's skeleton key to it, Finnegan's Wake. It's 17 years, 16, 17 years after Ulysses. He sometimes calls Ulysses the book of the day. It's the book of the day. Almost goes hour by hour through a day, but not quite. And we'll look at that in just a moment, depending on where we are. It's just a moment. And A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man is often seen as the prequel to the Book of the Day. A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man features Stephen Dedalus as he goes through his education in different stages of his education, including his time at his Jesuit college, Latin speaking friend of his. And that is where he puts forward his goal that he seems to be sort of not working towards in Ulysses, which is to create the uncreated conscience of his people, to speak with the voice of the Irish. And yet he will run into many obstacles, including the fact, do you know what language the Irish speak? It's like the language that the Americans speak English. Is that their native tongue? The Irish. No, there is an Irish language, Gaelic, but it had disappeared by early 20th century. Very similar to the reason that Cajun French has disappeared in Louisiana to a large extent. Do you know why that is? There were lots of French speakers down here, but they were told not to learn French. The children of these people who moved down here were told not to speak French, but told to learn English. It was pushed down, the French speak. The same thing with Irish. The schools would teach English. And so Stephen Dedalus does not know any Irish. He knows English. And so when he writes, whose language does he write? Language of his oppressors. But what is his religion? His religion is Roman Catholicism. Roman Catholicism. Does his religion come from his own land? No. And there is a language of Roman Catholicism. It is Latin. Is Latin Irish or English? No. So he is oppressed by two different traditions from two different lands, which are not his own. His Roman Catholic learning, all of the Latin and the theological thoughts he's absorbed, St. Paul, St. Augustine, Thomas Aquinas. So he's a fine thinker. He's an excellent student. He learned what he needed to learn, but he questions it and what its value is, and whether it's meant to oppress him. And it's the same thing in the secular tradition with that which is English as well. How can he possibly, someone filled with thoughts from others in languages not his own, speak with a voice of his own? This is one of the great questions of modernism. How can I, as an American, break free of, say, this English tradition while myself speaking a language imposed on me by their former colonization of this land? I hope there is some way. And that is precisely what Stephen Dedalus is trying to figure out. He calls in the second chapter history a nightmare from which he wishes to escape. Nightmare from which he wishes to escape. And he knows his history. He doesn't ignore history because of this, but he seeks to, how do you escape the language that you speak? How do you escape the history that you are a part of? For questions of self-determination and autonomy, this is a major question. Are you free, if you are bound to a single language, to in some way transcend it? Are you free, you are bound to a single or even a dual history or dual tradition? Are you free to break yourself from it? Are you less free if you don't know that you are bound to a tradition or a language? Are you more free if you do? Or do you only see the shackles on your wrists? One wonders. One wonders. In any case, James Joyce would eventually die in 1941 from an operation on perforated duodenal ulcer. That's an ulcer in your stomach. I highly recommend you against drinking too much coffee, getting too stressed, and ever having one of those. You're just starting to extraordinarily painful. But in an attempt to remove that pain from his life, he the surgery, I don't know that it was botched, but it was unsuccessful, and he did then die. All right. Let's just say a couple more things before we move forward. Setting of Ulysses. It is set in Dublin, Ireland, June 16, 1904. Dublin is now the capital of Ireland. Ireland is now its own sovereign nation. At the time of the writing of this work, it was not. And at the time of its setting, it was not. So this would be like being set during American colonial times, as it were. There is a tension between the Irish and their British occupiers. And this tension shows up over and over again, just in two particular ways. A, everybody speaks English. B, when they take out their money, what is generally on money? One side of it. If you have any money, I've got some that's hard to get out. Yeah, just throwing it around. What's on this side of a dollar bill? George Washington. Who was he? He was a president. President is sort of like a what? He had to choose not to be such a person. A king. Well, Ireland and Britain were not democracies. Britain's still not a democracy, by the way, in early 20th century. Who do you think was on English money? A king, sovereign figure. But who do you think used English money at this time? More importantly, not just the English, but who else? The Irish. So every time you spoke, or one spoke, or paid for something, one saw evidence of one's colonization, of the oppressors of one's sovereign nation. You couldn't escape it. You can't escape it in this situation. And this is part of the labyrinthine, Kafkaesque feel of Ulysses. How does one escape language and history and the notion of being oppressed, because one is not simply oppressed by someone saying, I oppress you, but by how the forces of power exercise themselves in subterranean and superterranean ways that are both sub and super conscious. That the force and fact of oppression is one that is hard to even articulate and detail out. It is not a simple and straightforward process, but an overwhelming process, or something like being enmeshed in water and absorbing it into one's skin, whether one knows it or not. You know, your skin gets kind of nasty if you're in water for a while. Oh, wow, how did that happen? So your skin knows how it happened. It absorbed all of the water, but you don't recognize it. Is that how the absorption of history and culture and tradition happens? Not just through your actual technical learning, where someone is speaking to you, trying to convey knowledge to you, but everything that you're involved with in your day. Does it reinforce that? Scary question to think about. You drink your Starbucks and listen to your Apple headphones and you think, am I a part of the history that I cannot wake up from? Or perhaps even many systems that I'm unaware of the effect of? And the answer is, I'll say, clearly yes, clearly yes. But it is up to you how much you wish to open your eyes to that which is around you. And in fact, I would say myself, I'm very much unconscious of many of the forces that affect myself as well. But I can give you hints and tips at how to see for yourself what it is you wish to see. All right. In any case, I'm going to conclude with just a couple of things about Ulysses, a couple of quotes from other people about him. This comes from the New York Times. There's a claim made by Seamus Heaney, supposedly. He's himself a famous Irish poet and translator of Beowulf. Wrote very beautiful sort of poems on fens and bogs, if you're interested in such things. If you like swampy literature, which I would imagine some Louisiana people do. Joyce himself has long been used to promote Irish tourism. At the head of a pantheon of great Irish writers like W.B. Yeats, for example, a very famous poet. Every year encouraged by state and city tourism organizations, a swelling army of Joyce fans travel to Dublin to celebrate Bloomsday, the anniversary of June 16, 1904, when the story of Ulysses unfolds. Joyce remarks that if his Dublin were destroyed, it would be possible to recreate it from the details in his novel. So something you will note as you read this novel is that it takes place in real places. Occasionally, these places did not exist in 1904, but would exist later or had by that time been destroyed or repurposed or changed. That said, one thing often said about Ulysses, and in fact said by its own author, is that it attempts to contain a city that really existed at a real time with some small errors in it. So when we encounter Ulysses, we encounter something like a snapshot of a place that did exist in time. And even if the details aren't 100% accurate, the idea is to encapsulate, like a snow globe, the soul or the essence of a time and place and all that happened there. So we will spend the next few days talking about one day, which is Bloomsday, and I look forward to doing that with you in future sessions. Thank you.